Okay. Happy Friday, everyone. Because of the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So happy to do that. Dr. Joe Gaugler holds the Robert L. Kane Endowed Chair in Long-Term Care and Aging at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, where he is also a distinguished McKnight University professor. As the director of the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation, Joe leads efforts to advance the well-being of older adults. He is also the director of the CDC-funded BOLD Public Health Center of Excellence on Dementia Caregiving and the NIA-funded Embrace Alzheimer's and Dementia Caregiving Research Centers. Wow. Joe's passion for supporting families and improving dementia care drives his research, where he focuses on innovative solutions for caregiving challenges. Alongside his work, he edits The Gerontologist, a leading journal in aging research. Through his leadership and dedication, Joe continues to make a lasting impact on dementia care and healthy aging. So what we don't see in the bio, Joe is one of my KO1 mentors, great mentor, but he is also a great restaurant connoisseur. So if you're ever out at a conference and you're like, I need a suggestion, go to Joe because he always finds a great place. So happy to introduce Joe and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for having me out here today. Such a pleasure. I've always said this before. I feel like I work at Johns Hopkins, given how many collaborations I have. And I could just look in the room right now. You've heard my longtime collaboration with Dr. Parker, but I see in the room here Dr. Quincy, of course, Dr. Samus, who's an MPI on the STARS U54, which we'll talk about briefly. George, who I've known many years through APA Division 20. I've known Carl Hill, Dr. Thorpe, both of you. I'm waiting for your submission to the gerontologist for the special issue. Please send it in soon. And the list goes on and on. Hey, Rahan is here too. She's part of STARS. So yeah, so many great colleagues, and I always appreciate the opportunity to be here. I thought I'd do something slightly different for this presentation. I could have come up here and talk about research project X, Y, and Z and how great and wonderful it all is, but I wanted to do something different. And I don't know if maybe we do this personally, maybe not publicly like I'm about to do, but this talk I gave originally a few years ago as part of a school public health seminar, and I updated it for today. It was originally called An Anatomy of Failures, and I'm gonna basically talk about really some of the failures I've had as it relates to research, but in the big picture, how those failures served as the foundation for this current program of research. And hopefully, I'm not saying this will necessarily inspire you, but maybe at least give you a sense of taking the long view in building our programs of research is so important. It's very easy to get discouraged, and you'll see currently I've been discouraged many, many times over the years, but at the same time, sometimes those failures can again really help fuel subsequent work and maybe in some instances make that subsequent work even better or more impactful. So that's kind of the theme for today, and hopefully it's what you were expecting. You know, I did do this maybe in a peak when I did this. At the time when I pulled this original presentation together, many of my colleagues go on social media and say, I am blessed to have this paper published, or, look at me, I got this award or that award. And I'm not really that type. I'm not saying, hey, if you do it, good for you, build your brand, go for it, you do you. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I don't really do that. And I thought this was in a way an antidote to all of that I've seen. There's plenty of self-promotion out there. Maybe we should take a different perspective sometimes. I wanted to start with, for those of you that are qualitative researchers, of bracketing, because I want to make very clear my perspective is a limited one. As a cisgendered white male, 50 years old, I'm sorry to say that, but I had to be honest. I am a first-generation college student. My mother's actually an immigrant from Italy. Maybe that's where I get the restaurant connoisseurship from, Lauren. So, and my dad actually, he was not a college graduate. He started college for a year, then joined the Marines. He fought in Vietnam. He passed away back in 2018, but he actually earned his undergraduate and later graduate degrees when I was in college. So he earned his master's degree actually when I was around my age now. So that was always an interesting career that I'm sure influenced me. You've heard about my scientific interest is really on dementia care innovation. I've been in this field probably 24 years now, if I count 25, if you count my postdoctoral fellowship. But again, I just want to emphasize this is where I'm coming from. I know it's not going to necessarily reflect many of your wonderfully diverse backgrounds, but I thought it was important. I have a daughter, Sophia, and I'm very proud to say as of May, a Great Dane named Thor. You see him there. He's 140 pounds. I told some of you about that yesterday. So, I mean, you might have seen some of this, maybe when you come across professional development literature, but many fact, it's probably too late for me to actually do this because of how time consuming it would be given I've been in the field 24, 25 years, but this idea of compiling an alternative CV of failures, logging every unsuccessful effort as it relates to research. Don't dwell on it, but just keep a tally. And maybe at one point, if you're willing to make it public, it's going to be 6 times as long as your normal CV. And it might be depressing, but it'll remind you of some of these truths. But again, this essential aspect of what it means to be an actual scientist. And again, we rarely talk about our failures and rejections, but in the end, it's essential to our work and how it progresses. So again, there's a really interesting article. I read the Inside Higher Ed fairly regularly, and several years ago, this particular faculty person talked about and illustrated how much of what he does fails. And they're invisible while the successes are visible. But that also gives others the impression that most things work out. And I certainly feel that way sometimes too. But in reality, to get to a certain point, it really does take a degree of resilience and I think a balanced perspective too. Again, whether we necessarily talk about that in our professional development activities while we're kind of learning the tricks of the trade, I wonder sometimes, but nonetheless, it's important. There are alternative perspectives to this, and I think they're useful to consider, where only successful people can actually afford a CV of failure. While this effort might be correlated with success, doesn't really miss hard truths, meaning that it's more difficult to discuss failures when one is not in a position of success to do so. And perhaps a CV of good fortune is more appropriate. So there's always alternative perspectives to this, but nonetheless, I think reflecting on where we failed and how it's led us to where we are is useful and a useful exercise. Now, again, I could have made various versions of this presentation. Today, I'm talking more about an anatomy of failures in some of my research initiatives, but you could envision, I could do one on anatomy of failures in personnel supervision, an anatomy of failures in financial budgeting, an anatomy of failures in teaching and instruction. But that being said, this whole idea of discovery as an unending journey, where it's really characterized by this understanding of current knowledge, but this small steps of iteration where we often hit dead ends. This gentleman, Dr. Berger, is very interesting. In his courses, 5% of the final grade is based on the quality of failure of students. It allows students to take more risks and are more engaged. So I think the sharing of errors is actually very valuable, and we seem very reluctant to do it, don't we? I'm reluctant to do it sometimes. I'll be blunt, in the particular division I'm in the School of Public Health, Health Policy and Management, my disciplinary fit as a psychologist in terms of my background isn't an ideal fit. And sometimes I wonder if the health economists or others not look down at me, look askance. I mean, at what I'm doing, I'm an NIH funded researcher. Most of them are these contract research types, and certain comments are made in faculty meetings. I talked about this with George yesterday, where I love interacting with my colleagues in a one-to-one basis. They're very nice people and wonderful. But for some reason, when we get in a faculty meeting, the whole dynamic changes. There's a whole cultural shift where you have factions and issues and concerns. And interestingly enough, our division faculty meeting is being held right about now, and luckily I'm here. So I'm much more happy to be here than there, I can assure you. At least I have a good excuse. So, but in any event, and maybe some of you have witnessed this too. Now, I understand at this point in your career, it's probably not that comfortable to go out and say, hey, everyone, I failed on this and this and this. I mean, I know that's not something you're necessarily going to make public, but maybe it's something more as a personal development tool that you can use and rely upon, okay? I don't know if this is helpful to this audience. Would you like me to do a real quick and dirty overview of the NIH grant funding structures? I assume you all know this here pretty well. Again, when I've given this talk in the past, it's often to grad students, and I realize many of you are now much more advanced in your career, but I always thought it was helpful to at least provide an overlay of what the different mechanisms of R, ranging from R's, F's, K's, T's, P's, and U's, to kind of understand and position ourselves as far as where we're at in our research career, but then also what to aim for later. When I look back on my career, it started really with the RO3, which I think many of you have pursued. I actually didn't go for a K1 at the time. I didn't even know what a K1 was at that time. I didn't have the luxury of, having a wonderful center like the RCMAR here. It was kind of me just learning myself. And but that being said, I have leveraged Ks for latter parts of my career. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how I think that was really essential for me to allow me to get to the point to feel confident enough and to build infrastructure within myself and my team and beyond to go for these larger infrastructural efforts, the U-54s, the P-30s, maybe one day a T-32 along those lines. And so even though it was somewhat of a linear structure, it was recursive, a lot of failure, a lot of going back and forth, as you'll see shortly. But at the same time, I think understanding how all these mechanisms can fit and influence each other over time is important when considering building your own career. Now, again, many of you may not want to oversee infrastructural research support, and I don't blame you. Vince Moore told me this once, and at the time I just kind of dismissed it. I said, why is he saying this? But he said, Joe, if you go in for any type of these P grants, a P01, P30, even a U, it's service work. You're doing professional service. I was like, what are you talking about? That's the apex. Didn't you want to achieve that and accomplish that? But now that we've started to launch some of these and I've kind of seen how much work it actually takes to get them off the ground and likely to maintain them and allow them to be successful, he was dead right. So, I mean, it's also a warning to some extent if one wants to go in this direction, is to ensure you have the partnerships in place to allow them to be successful. At a place like Johns Hopkins, I will say you're very blessed. I mean, when I look and think and consider all the different people that are available at this institution, you can almost naturally come together to pursue U's and P30s and T grants, and you are often successful. For someone like me at the University of Minnesota, again, a great institution, but actually it's pretty thin when you actually look at people interested in aging research, much less dementia care research. It's a much harder proposition. But again, by getting these Ks, getting engaged in other national infrastructure efforts, it allowed me to build partnerships with people like Quincy, and many others to be successful. And that was kind of the strategy I had to take. Nonetheless, it hasn't precluded me from criticizing leadership, well, not criticizing, discussing with leadership at the University of Minnesota, why don't we have a similar depth so we don't have to, as much as I love Quincy and working with her, it'd be nice to kind of keep these a little bit more internal at the University of Minnesota, but we're not there yet, but maybe this work, will hopefully lead to that. So, again, when talking about the CV of failure, I certainly didn't have the time or ability to pull one together, but one thing that's always very sobering to me is to look at your ERA Commons account. And so what I did was I pulled on my ERA Commons. This is just a snapshot of all the grants that have failed, that I've submitted and didn't go anywhere after the fact, at least literally. And you can see the large list here of the RO3s, RO1s. There's a P20 on here that we went in for the National Institute of Nursing Research. This was back in 2017, that got a really good score but didn't proceed. Another noteworthy one is this R35. This actually was based on a lot of work that you'll now see in some of our recent infrastructure grants, like the U-54 and the Embrace Roybal, where we literally had, I recall, I got a good score. I had, I want to say 2, maybe 3 meetings with program officers, asking questions, figuring out. I thought, well, we're getting close. We're going to get it funded. Of course, it didn't get funded. So many of these types of examples, as you can see here. I'm not sure if many of you have a similar ERA Commons account. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But honestly, I think this is a natural part of, if we're interested in building research, pursuing research in this NIH space, eventually it probably will look like this. Okay. So I wanted to point out one line of research or group of research about where it started in failure and how it actually ended up in, I hope, will be success. And it really kind of culminates with some of these centers that Dr. Parker had mentioned before. So in 2017, National Institute of Nursing Research, they put out a call for P20s. A P20 is basically, it's almost a pilot of a center grant. And that particular center was focused on multiple chronic conditions. And so I went in with that. I partnered with the Mayo Clinic at the time. Again, we got a very promising score. It might have been in the 30s or something, but it didn't get funded. And so it was tough to swallow at the time. It was my first effort at actually putting in a P grant at the time. So that led in 2018 to our first attempt at a Roybal Center. This was when they first came out with the ADRD Roybal Center, similar to the RCMAR, how you have both non-dementia and dementia. The Roybal Center split in that regard in 2018 too. And this was right around the time I moved from nursing into the School of Public Health. I assumed the Robert L. Kane endowed position like 3 months before this was due. And I felt like, we're ready, let's do it, let's go for it. So my big mistake when I put in a P30, and I kind of alluded to this before, was I still saw a P30 very much along the lines of an R grant, in that it was about me and I'm strong enough and I can pull this all together myself and it'll go great. And guess what? It went in and it didn't get scored. I mean, and it was like a punch to the gut to me, because I just didn't understand why it didn't. And I mean, I felt like we had a compelling proposal, but One of the things I did, and maybe this is a point many of you could follow, maybe it's useful, is what I then endeavored to do over the next several years was I tried to get on grant review panels to start reviewing P-level grants, program project grants, T32s, U's, and often NIA is desperate for looking for reviewers for these things. So I just tried to say, hey, if I'm available, get me on these. And it was hugely helpful because then it led to some of these subsequent first failure again, but then finally to success. So you heard me talk about this R35. This really came largely out of my very lucky involvement with the NIA Impact Collaboratory. I don't think many of you need me to review this, what it is. One of the largest scale grants I think NIA or cooperative agreements NIA has ever given. I think it was $54 million. The goal really is to advance methodology of embedded pragmatic clinical trials of dementia care innovations in healthcare systems. So there were many cores, there were around 60 institutions involved in this. I was lucky enough, Laura Gitlin, who was the lead of the implementation core and a great colleague, again, she was at Johns Hopkins at the time, asked me to be the associate lead. So that then forced me to learn more about implementation science. If there's two take-home points from this presentation, maybe it bores you, I don't know. If there are two, are this. One is this whole idea of building off failure and not being ashamed of it. Two, if you are confronted with the need to learn some new methodology of some kind, you know what the best way to learn about it is? Create a class and teach it. And so that's what I did. I basically created the Implementation Science Interdisciplinary Doctoral Seminar. I first offered it in 2020, and it was the best way to immerse myself in this methodological space and to allow me to be prepared to actually co-lead the implementation core. So with this knowledge, and then also the other great thing about Impact was the ability to create really strong partnerships with people across the country. People I knew about, but maybe didn't interact with as much. And that really served as a foundational jumping off point for some of the subsequent work. One was this R35. I believe Jennifer Wolf has one of these. I'm not jealous. And so I think she got it on the same year as I did. So, but basically, again, I had talked about it was well scored, but for reasons, I think at the programmatic level, they just weren't comfortable in supporting it. But I ended up taking a lot of what I learned from the Impact Collaboratory, and then all of these efforts, the Roybal Center, to some extent the P20, and certainly the R35, and that actually then spun out into efforts that were eventually successful. But you see how long this took. I mean, it's a 5 to 7 year process. It's not, now many of you are much smarter than I am and brilliant, and you're gonna just go in and be successful. Great, congratulations. I'm not that person. It takes me longer to learn. And so it led to some of these efforts that, beginning in 2020, the CDC put out a call for applications for bold public health centers of excellence. These aren't research centers, they're dissemination centers, and they're really designed to engage public health agencies across the country to advance dementia as a public health imperative. And so 3 national centers were funded, one on early detection, which is led by Sue Borson and Josh Chodosh at NYU, one on risk reduction, that's the Alzheimer's Association National Office. I don't know if Dr. Hill's involved with that, but that was where that came out of. And then the third was actually on dementia caregiving. We were lucky enough to get that. And I can say with a great deal of certainty, if I was not on the Impact Collaboratory, if I hadn't taught that class in implementation science, I would not have been successful with the Bold Center because it's all dissemination. And so I could actually call on that literature to identify models of dissemination, embedding that into the proposal body itself, and it was well received to that regard. The other thing I had talked about leveraging Ks, not on this list because it wasn't a failure necessarily, but way back in around 2008 or so, I actually pursued a K2. I don't know if anyone's familiar here with a K2. It's a mid-career development award. And why it was such a great opportunity is at the time, I was tried and true quantitative researcher. But it became very evident in doing the work I was doing, both in starting to develop interventions and really in just studying dementia caregiving longitudinally, I needed more qualitative methodological expertise to really understand this experience and to help it better inform the work and the interventions we designed. So I went in for that KO2, and really ever since, all of my work has been imbued with this mixed methodological approach. Just like with implementation science, along with that, I taught a mixed method seminar, and I've been teaching that now for 14 years. But it's really helped influence my work. So similarly, more recently in 2021, I went in for what's called a K7, which is an academic career leadership award. So these are for, scholars who are more established that are hoping to develop certain types of infrastructure in aging science at their home institutions. There are multiple of you I could imagine could go in for a K7, would be very successful. And the way I positioned the K7 was we're going to build infrastructure in dementia care intervention science at the University of Minnesota. Again, it included a curricular development, which is nice because now I can just roll it into my K7. So now we have an entire curriculum on dementia care intervention science that includes the mixed methods and implementation science seminars, as well as some other courses. And also I have identified fellows, there's around 12 to 13 now across the US, where we engage in peer mentorship to help them develop their work. And, I've asked some of you in this room to join and you were too busy, but nonetheless, we still have a great group of mentees. I'm not gonna say who that was. But in any event, so what the K7 did was actually show demonstrably that there is infrastructure in dementia care intervention science at the university. There's a curricula that's been developed. So that then finally led, and we could call on all of this when we went in for the Roybal Center in 2023. Unlike 2018, I learned my lesson. I knew that in order for it to be successful, I would have to leverage national partnerships to make it work. And one thing in the RFA that was very clear is Roybal Centers this round must really engage in a national recruitment strategy to support trials. So what could I call on for the Embrace this time? I could call on my relationships with Andrea Gilmore-Bykowski at Wisconsin, who's an MPI on this. I could certainly leverage my long-term standing collaboration with Laura Gitlin, who's the co-lead of the Behavioral Intervention Development Core, and then also Nancy Hodgson, who was part of the Implementation Core in Impact. And then we also have what are called Embrace Mentors, who are going to provide consultation and educational content as part of the Roybal. Guess who that is? Basically the entire implementation core of NI Impact plus Cheryl Zimmerman, who was also an Impact. So you see how all these things built together. It took me a long time to get to this point, this kind of legacy of a failure, as it will, but how all these things eventually fit together. It just took time. And it took a lot of partnership building and effort to get there, and a long view picture. I understand now all of us have the luxury to have a long view. But that being said, for me anyway, that's where I had to work towards. And then similarly, I don't know if Quincy talked about this at all in her presentation. We were recently notified funding of a U54 called STARS, the State Alzheimer's Research Support Center. And why I wanted to know this is, again, it leverages all these partnerships we've developed over time. I've known Quincy many years. And so I found out Quincy wanted to go in herself at Johns Hopkins. So I called her, we engaged, like, Quincy, let's just go in together. So we did that. And then Regina Shee, who was part of the BOLD Center, I knew she had done awesome work in data as it relates to home and community-based services and dementia. A big emphasis of STARS is working with states to help them basically identify and then deposit their data on dementia care services and supports into a national repository. So researchers, policymakers, and others can understand for whom, in what areas, locations, communities these services work. It's going to take a lot of engagement, a lot of partnership, a lot of data expertise. And luckily, Regina Shee has a view. Yes, hello. I can hear you, Peggy. How you doing?
Sorry about that.
That's all right, Peggy. I'm speaking. Did you have a question or?
Okay. No, I did not have a question.
By the way, Peggy Dilworth-Anderson, when you talk about leveraging partnerships, was a Robert L. Kane Memorial Lecturer for our endowed chair a couple of years ago. You should have seen her presentation. It was fabulous. Glad to have you on, Peggy. But in any event, what was I talking about? The STARS. So with STARS, it leveraged all of these partnerships, and so in building the MPI structure and partnering with Quincy, partnering with G, so we all could go in together versus each of us competing against each other. The other thing it leveraged was the BOLD Center. We already had built all these partnerships with departments of health across the country who were doing this work in dementia care services and supports. So we were able to solicit letters of support from, I think, 15 to 20 states that we put in with the application. All of these things contributed to us getting this. I mean, hopefully this all makes sense and is useful for you when thinking of a trajectory of failure, but a trajectory of failure that can then build to something maybe much greater than I had ever imagined. Now, I won't say this has been easy for me in terms of my mental health and well-being. After the Embrace, the Embrace was due in June 2023, and then the U54 RFA just kind of came out. I think, Quincy, if I recall, it came out in like August or September. We had 2 months to pull all this together, and that was right on the heels of our Embrace Roybal. So it was a very challenging year this past year to get all of this in, but at the same time, I think it was worth it in the end. We have a chance to partner and do some great work. Okay, does that all make sense, everybody? Yeah, I hope this can influence you in thinking about, again, failure. Um, I don't think I need to talk much about this. We've already talked about how I've leveraged K awards in the past, but let's kind of reflect on overall lessons and strategies here. This was developed by a great colleague of mine in RCTSI at the University of Minnesota, Jane Fulkerson. And these were her lessons and strategies she provided. I thought they were really good in terms of thinking about how to build resilience in our scientific career. One is developing and following timelines. Two, and I can't emphasize this enough, and I believe you've built this into the RCMAR here, this idea of getting feedback on internal, external sources where possible. One of the things I did with the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation, one of the first things, is we actually created what's called the Aging Work Group. This is a group of faculty that come together monthly and provide in-depth review of grant proposal ideas from other members. I've gone through it, others have in the past. Then we also coordinate a very robust external review where actually members of the Aging Work Group, and by the way, any of you can join this. Anyone can join the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation at the University of Minnesota. We conduct a very robust external review where the applicant will basically name the top 7 to 10 people in the country on the topic. I'll invite them, pay them, and we do a review. We record it, and our hit rate has been pretty substantial. I think we started this back in 2020, 2019. I think we've supported now 15 extramural grants, most of them NIH. I've gone through the process twice myself. It's been very successful. Review or watch NIH study section videos. I think this is a great idea if you don't have an opportunity to review yourself. That I think is the best learning if you can do it. But if you can't, is to review these videos. I don't know if many of you do this, blocking time to think or write. And again, this is easier said than done. I literally do this probably a month or two before the start of every semester, is I block off 2 half days a week, no Zoom calls. I use a tool called Calendly. I don't know if you use that for meetings, which has probably saved me thousands of hours of time. I'm sure you get the emails too. Joe, what time do you have in the next couple of weeks to meet? When can you meet? When can you meet in the next 3 months, 6 months? It's blah, blah, blah. So I use Calendly, and that syncs with my Google Calendar. So if anyone wants to meet with me or schedule a time, they cannot schedule a time when I block out the no Zoom call blocks. If you can do that, I highly recommend it. It's really helped me in terms of carving out writing time and space, okay? This is for me, and I don't know if you write this way. I guess I hesitate to give this because everyone's writing style is different. It's as much craft as science. I tend to break writing into very small parts, and I almost assemble a puzzle at the end. I kind of feel like when I think of my writing style, that's allowed me, I think, to take on multiple writing assignments like we all have to, but not get bogged down or to miss timelines. That's been helpful to me. This last one is good too, and it's hard to parse out when you're first starting because we have the tendency to just incorporate all criticism, embrace useful criticism, but be able to discern what is useful or not. And honestly, be able to discern, and it takes time to get to this point, I know, be able to discern at what point you've gotten enough feedback. Enough is enough. I remember once, and this was not in aging, but someone had said, well, I had done a specific aims and I went through 150 drafts. And I kind of felt, is that a good thing? I don't think that's good. I mean, it was kind of held up as, wow, I was so persistent. I guess it was, but I don't know. I think there's a tipping point at some point where enough is enough. And building and having the confidence to say, I have enough feedback, I'm going to incorporate it and address it is I think, a very important skill when moving ahead and being successful in, this whole space of trying to build a strong research program. The last thing, and again, this is what I feel, I don't know if you feel this way, is I guess I've gotten to the point as I moved on in my career is I am much more excited and inspired by the success of others than myself. So for example, considering my team and all the great things they've done, and this is our current research team right now. You see many of them here. Some of you might know these people. Katie Luagi, for example, some of you might know. She's really the person that oversees all of our projects. But again, we have a number of different coordinators working. We're not as many grad RAs right now, but in the past we certainly have. And one thing I like to do at the end of each year is I take my whole team out to lunch, and I'll actually put together a year in review where we just sit back and take stock of what we accomplished in the past year. And I don't know if we do this enough for ourselves. I'm often shocked at how productive our team is. Because I don't know about you, I'm fairly self-critical. I'm like, man, I'm not doing enough. I got to do this, I got to do blah. But in reality, taking stock, it really helps, I think, us all realize, hey, look, we're actually doing a lot of work. And so when I look at the team, for example, in 2023 alone, we had 32 publications, 38 scientific presentations, and probably most importantly, or as important as any of that, we do a lot of community outreach work, and so we directly engage over 3,000 people in our presentations and other things. And all of these things fit together in terms of the space of the Families and Long-Term Care Projects. Again, dementia care innovation. And I know this is of great value to our team too. And then when I look back and think of all the other people that I've worked with over the past 5-6 years and all of their success, these are all former grad RAs and postdoc research associates, and how all of them have landed really successful positions, either as faculty or as research scientists, in the case of Colleen at the University of Michigan. And then, the other thing we've built is the Robert L. Kane Postdoctoral Fellowship. Again, we don't have a T32 at Minnesota for some of the reasons I described. We don't quite have the critical mass, I think, to be that successful. So what I did instead was I used the endowed chair that Bob Kane built, my predecessor and mentor and colleague, to really fund postdocs. And so up to now, we've funded 4 of them, and many of them have been very successful. One you know quite well, which is Dr. Kimbang, who thankfully received support and guidance and mentorship through this RCMAR. I was very excited for that. So her K got a 10. She went through the Aging Work Group external review process and the whole thing. And, she's a Bush Fellow now. She'll also be one of our Embrace Year 1 trials too. And so she's just carving out a spectacular niche in this space of aging and dementia care in the African immigrant community. Zach Baker was the other of our first R.L. Kane postdocs. Again, he got a K99R00 when he was a postdoc. He got a priority score of 14. And in this vein of failure, what was interesting with Zach is when we did the external review I talked about with the Aging Work Group, he actually was given the advice, it's not ready, you can't go in. And he took that advice and incorporated the feedback and then did the review again, resubmitted, he got a priority score of 14. And so now he's an assistant professor in the College of Nursing and Health Innovation at Arizona State. Some of our more recent postdocs, and again, I'm fairly certain soon they will also have grants to report here, was Quentin Cotton. He's an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dana Urbanski, who's at the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center. So again, this is all things that when I think of this whole idea of a trajectory of failure, I look to this. As I think Jennifer Wolf called this, and when reflecting on Cheney Fabius, her happy place, like Cheney Fabius, her happy place of all the great success she's had. That's how I feel about all of these people here. And of course, I'd be remiss by not talking about Lauren Parker. Her K got a priority score of 11. You're slacking, not as good as Mako, but really good. So I'm joking, Lauren. I wish I could get an 11. Trust me, I haven't gotten 11 in a long time. So it's a great accomplishment. Lauren obviously is building a strong career. She, really the K was built off admin supplements, right? Lauren, that you got off the R01 that Laura Gitlin and I were PIs on. And again, Lauren will be an Embrace Year 1 trial too. And the Embrace Year 1 trials, they're not really pilot. Actually, they're not pilots at all. They're like R21s. So Lauren actually, it's going to be 2 years of grant funding to test and develop an intervention. You see some of the other faculty we worked with before. I want to bring up Shekinah because this is an interesting point. So Shekinah, again, highly successful researcher, great colleague, someone I enjoy working with every day. She got an R21 too, very successful. I don't know if she went through the Aging Work Group process, but nonetheless, great milestone for her in her career. So with Shekinah, she was at the University of Minnesota, and now she's just starting at the University of Pennsylvania. So at one level, you could say, well, maybe that's a failure, Joe. You lost this, quote unquote, lost this great person. But the way I reflected when Shekinah was talking about this, and I feel very grateful that she was comfortable enough to come talk to me, saying I'm thinking about going to Penn, is the way I approach it is, well, I'm gonna put on 2 hats. One is as endowed chair at the University of Minnesota. I don't want you to go, stay, please, please, please. Okay, that was the one side. But then the other side was, okay, as just a mentor or as a colleague, you have to pursue this. It's a great position. I think it's a named assistant professor position. There are some potential cons too, but nonetheless, we talked through that, and she made the decision that was best for her and her family. And the reason why I still look at Shekinah and I will continue to consider Shekinah a great colleague and look at it with pride is, we'll continue working with Shekinah. She's still a member of great standing in the Center for Health, Aging, and Innovation, and I think we'll continue working together. And would I have approached this the same way 15 years ago? Probably not. But now I feel like, with some experience and hopefully understanding the mentorship process better, I feel great, and I'm thrilled for Shekinah and everything she's accomplished. And then you see some other of our early faculty as well. I'm going to stop here for questions and discussion. I know I went through that somewhat quickly, but like I said, I could create a failure presentation that could go on for 2 or 3 hours. It would bore you. But nonetheless, I wanted us to really just reflect on our own careers, reflect on our own progression, how it is really going to be marked by quote unquote failure, and honestly being marked by failure that maybe others consider failure, but we shouldn't. I mean, you don't get funded, it's often seen as a failure by maybe a supervisor, an administrator, a bureaucrat, or something like that. But when I look back at the grants I've had successful, how many of them have built on, utilized, leveraged material that was from a failed proposal is, it's significant. So I think we always got to keep that in mind. This is recursive and a long view is necessary. And hopefully that's helpful. Questions or discussion or thoughts? Yeah. Yes, Joe. Sure, I can give it to you if you like.
Thank you so much. So much of what you said really resonated with me. I feel like I'm an expert. I'm an expert on failure. But I just had two things. One was I'd really be interested in looking at those papers. I don't know if you're willing to share this slide. My mentor, when I first started at my first career at Hopkins, I'm just mentioning this, told me to read a book called Advice to a Young Scientist. I don't know if you're Peter Medawar. Peter Medawar, I think was his name it's really, I think it applies. Yeah. But the other thing I was wondering was, for many years, actually, I was a mentor in the program that Dr. Parker participated in, the Advanced Research Institute. That's NIMH funded. And so it was really great experience to see other mentors, expert mentors. But one of the things that I was kind of surprised the first time I heard it was sometimes people got the advice, you just have to leave where you are. And I guess I was just wondering if you had any thought. It's not, I don't mean in terms of, well, that's a failure. They just meant sometimes the environment really isn't helping you, and I wondered if you had any.
That was a great point. Thank you, Joe. First, yeah, I'll definitely get that memoir. That sounds actually really good for our mentorship work. I'll definitely check that out. Thanks for that. So this idea of leaving where you are, this is a great point, Joe. I guess the best way I can answer that is thinking through some of the mentorship I've given to people in the past. I participated in the NRMN program. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it or have gone through it. I think, Roland, you were a mentor on that 1 year, right? Yeah, 5 years. So you've been many times. Yes, I did it 1 year. And one of the one person I remember mentoring the most that was the most challenging was to give them the advice that if you really want to pursue a research career, you have to get out of your current environment. Right. So listen to what this person went through. This is a junior person. She was at a place that didn't let her apply for the LRP at NIH. Like the people didn't understand they didn't understand what an LRP was. They thought it would commit her to doing research and she couldn't teach classes in her program, number one. And then number two, she tried to pursue some grants as a co-I. She kept getting pushback because of this teaching. She's in a discipline that is very teaching emphasized. Particularly, this is a regional institution she was at. So we had to tell this person, when you talk about leave where you are, is if you want to build and pursue a research career, you got to get out of here. You have to leave. I'm happy to say she left. She went and took a postdoc with someone very good, and she's going to be much better positioned. So the other thing is, and I think related to your question, Joe, is at what point is persistence become a problem in that, it's not going anywhere? Interestingly, I'm going to reflect on NRMN because there's another person in that situation. This person had applied for grant funding, I think 3 or 4 times, just wasn't being successful. And in reading their aims, it was clear they just couldn't conceptualize a study. They couldn't quite understand why this study is important. They couldn't articulate it or anything like that. And boy, I don't even know if I have good advice to leave where you're at. I think the best advice one can give is you have to trust, and hopefully you have a vibrant enough mentorship network that can tell you that. Now, you have to remember, this is coming from someone, Bob Kane was my mentor. I don't know if any of you knew Bob Kane at all. Bob Kane was a unique personality. He was one of the most intelligent people I've known. Renowned geriatrician, health services researcher in aging, internationally renowned. But Bob was also a person, he'd dismiss everything when you first brought it to him, everything. I have this idea, Bob. Oh no, that's not good enough. We've done this. What do you do? Et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I guess I have to reflect on my own career, Joe, and maybe it's built in a level of stubbornness and persistence that, in fact, I should reflect sometimes when I should give it up. Maybe thank you for your mentorship, Joe. I needed that. So no, there are definitely times. I remember the old days with NIH. Remember when you could resubmit 3 times? I remember one proposal I submit 3 times, didn't get funded. Then I went in another 3 times and it still didn't get funded. I'm stubborn. It took me that long to figure out, it's time to drop this idea. Hopefully all of you can come to a more quicker conclusion, but that's where good mentorship matters. Where someone you feel trust can say, not in a harmful way, but in ways like, look, this line of work it's not going anywhere. And maybe we have to reconvene, recalibrate, and think about anything of this is salvageable and rework it in a new idea. Yeah, I wish there was an easy answer. Like all these things, there's no easy answer. Depends on the person who you're working with. Some people won't listen. That's all. So as a mentor, that's all you can do is give best advice you can. Oh, great. Dr. Wallace? And then we'll go to Dr. Dilworth Anderson. Dr. Wallace, do you have a question? Gail Wallace?
Good afternoon. I'm an early career faculty, and actually I'll be meeting with you later today.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I was so relieved that you introduced yourself the way you did, because yesterday when the meeting started, I said, I'm a she, her, I'm a heterosexual woman. I didn't say Black woman. Yeah. And then I said, does anyone do that? And when you said you're a cisgender male and you mentioned your identity, I said, okay, great, it's okay. And then I asked myself, I said, is it okay because he's a white man? And he gave me permission to feel like the way I introduced myself was a legitimate way. But I also want to say that you're also coming from a psychological standpoint, which is great. And I'm a sociologist.
Yes.
So I'm looking at this from an intersectional framework.
It's interesting, yeah.
And when you talk about failure, I'm thinking about the failure that Black women experience over and over again, and they have to have the courage to try.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm grateful for is that although you're not at Johns Hopkins, I am. I have the luxury of being included this time because we do have JHAD-RCMAR.
Yes.
And I noticed you have a lot of scholars, and I was so hopeful because I saw the diversity. But one thing I want us to incorporate is well-roundedness, because when I talk to people, I say, where did you come from? And when I tell people I grew up in South Central Watts, California, with a mother that was born in the South and whose grandmother couldn't read or write, and I had to dodge poverty and bullets, I say that's a well-rounded person.
Mm-hmm.
And we need that. We just don't need to reproduce people to continue to mimic the same structural patterns and forget about the historical significance of intersectionality and the strength that Black women bring to the academy. And I'll close with this. As a white man, you would have more access to opportunities at universities than me, because even though I'm on the inside, there's a lot of stigma. And I want us to start to talk about that at JHAD-RCMAR. But I will change that because, like I said, I am at Johns Hopkins to stay, and I will be a trend breaker. Yeah. And I hope that you and I can do research together in the future as well.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate your leadership. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. That was wonderful. That's such a great point. The thing that resonated, many things resonated there with me, of course, but the big thing, Gail, was this idea of coming at it from a psychological versus sociological perspective. You're absolutely right. I'm a psychologist, and I'm using terms like resilience. That's a psychological term. It was pretty agnostic, wasn't it, in terms of the structures that could come into play that could harm many of our colleagues, that could hinder them and hold them back, and understanding how those operate. And also understanding too, I say this often to my mentees, don't use me as an example of productivity because it's not the right example. I think everyone's metrics of success aren't the same. You can't use a universal approach. For one faculty member, getting an RO3 at some point is a great achievement, and it should be celebrated and recognized as such. And too often we try to use this universal kind of metric approach saying, well, you must have X number of R1s, you must do this, you must have this many publications. And from a sociological perspective, understanding context is very, very important. Someone's personal historical context and what it means to be successful in the academy. I really believe this, and a successful unit, a successful academic culture is not about everyone being a superstar in terms of what we think as a superstar. The person has a lot of grant funding, a lot of publications. If you're surrounded by a lot of people like that, it's actually gonna be a miserable department, I would argue. In order for me to be successful, being and working with colleagues that excel in different areas, different spaces, different communities is what leads to true success, not only for the department, but for myself. As Dr. Wallace had indicated, I mean, if you note for many of our mentees, their diversity in background, you know, there is diversity as well in sexual identification. That certainly has had a major influence on me as well. This is very much bi-directional, make no mistake. So thank you, Dr. Wallace.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to talking with you later. Dr. Dilworth Anderson, please. Peggy.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to hear you speak again, Joe. Dr. Gaugler, I should say. And
Joe's fine. That's good. So, yeah.
and I so agree with many of the things that you've said this morning. And I appreciate what Dr. Wallace just noted, because that's very important, the intersectionality of our existences. And you know, what are the ingredients of that intersectionality and the historical impact of on that intersectionality, which probably created it in the beginning. But one of the things that I would like to say, or maybe add to what has been discussed thus far, is the notion of the multiplier effect for junior scholars who are moving ahead. I had a mentoring group at Chapel Hill for a decade, and the university saw fit to give me an award for it because of the success of the mentoring group and how we put it together. It started, I think, with me getting a KO7, I believe.
Oh, wow, great.
And so one of the things that we did to really increase the productivity was to create the multiplier effect. That the mentees would present their ideas, and we would identify people, or they would identify themselves, who else would be interested in co-authoring with this person. And what happened over time was that if you had one person presented and two other people said, I'll join you, that meant a publication for each one of them.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so finding common interests, overlapping skills, not the same skill sets, but different people bringing different skill sets in that multiplier model, you'll find that junior scholars will have more productivity.
That's
and
great.
that was
Yeah,
one of
that's
the
great.
outcomes of
Yeah.
our mentoring group.
Oh, wonderful, Peggy. I mean, I'll say this about Dr. Dilworth. I mean, this is one of the great mentors in all of gerontology. I mean, she really is. I mean, there's little doubt. So I appreciate those insights, Peggy. And I think the model's tremendous, and it's something I'll certainly consider applying for sure. Thank you, Peggy. And I mean, one thing I have learned is I always thought in the past mentorship was, you know, me mentoring people, me, the mentor, kind of almost this unidirectional flow of knowledge, right? By far the most effective modeling, mentorship models I've seen are peer models, where I actually don't say a whole lot. We come together as a group, we identify topics of professional interest, and I'll provide my insights, but again, with this understanding that it's from me, where I'm at in my career, and there are likely people have much more wisdom given where they're at in their career, their background, et cetera, that can actually help more satisfactorily address the mentoring issue than if it was just me by myself. And make no mistake, when I came up, the mentoring model I had was very much the old school, the great sage person that I must listen to. In the end, I don't think that's at all an effective mentoring model, if not now, ever, if it was ever. So thank you, Peggy, so much.
Joe, may I interject something else?
Yes, yes, please.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a very European white male apprenticeship model that has really permeated, and it still exists in the American academic world. The multiplier effect that I mentioned earlier is more intersectional, as Gail noted, because whoever has skills can come in, and it increases the productivity. However, as the apprenticeship model is rooted in the American institutions in higher ed, The more prestigious the university, I've found, the more likely are you to find that apprenticeship model.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
so I think for juniors, junior scholars, I believe need to be aware of what is the mentoring structure in your unit or your university, or your department, or your school. And when you go against that, your mentor in that department or school will need to advocate for you to say, I don't
Yeah.
know, below ask, what senior person do you have working with you?
Mm.
When everybody is on the writing team as an assistant professor or associate professor. That senior professor, I think, needs to advocate for different models,
Yeah.
especially with women and minorities
Yeah.
in the academy.
Yeah. That's a great point, Peggy. I've certainly of the belief, and you're Roland, definitely, but I'm kind of the belief, Peggy, I'm sure you agree with this, is we're so far past the one person mentor model. I mean, it's just not effective. I think ideal mentorship has multiple mentors for faculty, students, whomever, and those who are mentoring have to understand if someone, like, maybe for affinity purposes, others shifts more towards one person or the other, that's okay. You didn't fail as a mentor. It's not a betrayal. It's the natural way of things and how people progress, and what kind of advice and insight we need. Not all of us are universal experts. And that traditional European model seems to suggest that. And it's done so at the great detriment of many faculty, many students, quite frankly, many departments, I would argue, too, that I've seen. So, Roland, please, do we need a mic here, Roland?
So first of all, Joe, thank you for outstanding presentation. We talked about this just a little bit yesterday about race issue of failures. One thing I'd like to see if you have or anyone have any insights about the great conversation about the mentoring model and the difference between the apprenticeship and the multiplier effect. I totally agree with those. One thing I want to see if you have any insights on, how do you deal with this with promotion and tenure? Right? So when you deal with this mentorship model that most people who are sitting around the table at promotion and tenure don't know about it, they only know about the European model, and that's the model you now get evaluated on. So how do we deal with it? Do you have any insights on that? Or Peggy, if you have any, be happy for the early career to understand, because we run into this a lot.
Thanks. That's a great question. Peggy, I'll defer to you if you want to start on that.
Well, thank you, Roland, for that, Dr. Thorpe, on that very important question. And I don't think we have enough time today for me to really say what I need to say. So I'm going to try to condense it. I served on the promotion tenure committee in my department and for my school. And I think I chaired it at some point. I don't recall. But one of the things that I realized, I went into it knowing that that was most likely to happen, is that the senior professors did just what you're suggesting, Roland, most of the time. And looking at who's first author, who's the senior author, where they're publishing, and all of those things. It took quite a bit of doing to convince the committee that there are different ways to be awarded tenure and promotion. And I do think it's important for senior professors uh, who have the courage, because sometimes they don't have the courage either, to say, let's change this system or modify this system to benefit the university, to benefit the school. And of course, when we do that, we're benefiting the junior scholars in that regard. So it's important for us to advocate for change. And that's what I did. And I did see some change. Now, I received a lot of resistance, but if you know me well, that just like water off a duck's back. And so I wasn't fazed by that.
Yes.
And so this whole notion of these institutions doing that, it requires of us again to challenge that, to look at the APT, the appointment promotion tenure manual, and look at what's in there and go through that and see how we can make policy changes, because it can happen. It happened at UNC.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you consider intersectional pressures, challenges, the best way to put it, I guess. Forgive me if I'm using terms incorrectly. One need only look at the promotion tenure guidelines of a department. Like you, Peg, I've served every level of promotion tenure review at the University of Minnesota department, school, and there's actually all university. I sat on that for a few years too. And, you know, first and foremost, it's reflecting on the formal guidelines and changing those. Remember, those are legally binding for a university. And unless, and if you have certain, if there are certain expectations in those guidelines, if they need to be changed, they should be changed in writing first and foremost in those guidelines. That's number one. As Peggy alluded to, that can be a challenging process, particularly if there's longstanding resistance in a given unit. To me, at the same time, the kiss of death in any promotional tenure guideline is vagueness, you know, because that can then be used and often is used against scholars, you know, who, you know, for whatever reasons are being, you know, prejudiced against, right? That's number one. Number two, and I think you talked about this, Peggy, and I've had to do this myself, for example, at the all-school public health tenure level, is remember on that committee, you have biostats, they think of this very differently. You have epi, they think of it differently, you know, and then there's environmental health sciences at the University of Minnesota. There are several times where I've had to more or less, for lack of a better term, go to the mats for certain candidates who otherwise might have had a challenge getting through the all school or the school level, in part because they had skills that didn't necessarily fit the typical, you know, 25 publications, 1 R01, blah, 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 SPI, you know. And I don't even get me started on how community engagement is viewed. I mean, we all know community engagement does not adhere to the timeline of the tenure clock. I mean, it's a multi-year process to do it right and to do it well. And many faculty need to be educated in that. This resonates in particular, or should resonate, with a place like the University of Minnesota, which has as its mission, you know, it should be doing outreach, it should be doing engagement. That's part, it's as, you know, again, this can come in with multiple criticism when you talk to my Indigenous colleagues, the land grant university, sometimes people call it the land grab university because it took land from Indigenous peoples. But nonetheless, this idea that it was built primarily to provide education to those that at that point in the middle 19th century did not have access to education. That's in our mission. So community engagement scholarship must be part of the mission. But that's a different cycle. It's a different timeline. And some people don't understand that. Actually, many people don't understand it. Not some, many do. So at the same time, Peg, I'll use a nice term. It takes education for some of these others to understand what that means. But sometimes these can be, some often turn into arguments. But I know in our division and in the School of Public Health, they've built in a community engagement component to the tenure guidelines, which was a positive first step. But there's much more that needs to be done. I mean, think of it from, you know, I think of this, one of my other talks I give is on implementation science, and we've all heard the statistic, right? Takes 20 years from idea discovery to actually have something implemented. That only happens for 14% of the evidence-based innovations. That's incredibly wasteful. That's inefficient. Some could say it's an ethical imperative to fix that leaky pipeline. Well, what's one way to fix it? Conducting community-centered, community-engaged research that can best impact those communities, can scale interventions in a way that will fit those contexts so that they're culturally appropriate and effective and beneficial. Okay? But that also might mean it's probably going to be a timeline not of 20 years, but maybe of 10 years. 10-year clock is 6 years. You see what I mean? These things still don't align. But they have not just value on a personal, they have value from a scientific level. And I think that's the argument to be made. So, okay. Peggy, did you have another comment or question? Your hand is up, or I don't know if you did. Otherwise, we'll go over here.
I meant to take my hand down.
Oh, no problem, Peggy. We have a question in the audience here, so.
First of all, thank you for that insightful presentation. It made me learn a lot. So my question is about shifting from failure to resiliency. We often advise our students as well that, okay, don't take failure by heart. And I also learn a lot from my students. One time a student said, well, it is easier said than done. And that made me think, is it an individualistic perspective, again, the American perspective, which so much relies on individualism versus some cultures that have collectivism. You take support from others. So it's like that shift cannot be so quick. Now you have failed. It's a toll on you. So how do you just jump through that? So I thought, is there a process in there? So if you would share some formula, that would be great.
That was a really interesting perspective. This idea, and again, forgive me if I gave that impression of, you fail and, you can't take it emotionally. Make no mistake, I took it really emotionally. When I didn't get that Roybal, I don't know if you heard it, it literally felt like I got punched in the stomach. Because one thing I remembered, and this is adding in a personal perspective, forgive me, 2 days before the Roybal was due to the grants office, my dad died. All of that was part of this. And then to come back and say you weren't scored. Yeah, I didn't just get over that. Let's get, I'm going to be real clear. If I didn't make it clear in the presentation, I apologize if I did. I didn't get over it at all. I actually stewed on it for a long time. And I mean like a year, 2 years. So, and again, this is probably me as a person. When that happens, I don't necessarily, get depressed. I kind of get angry. And so my anger was okay, you know what? I'm going to get this. And first thing I'm going to do is, okay, I'm going to see how great these other center grants are. I'm going to sit on the panels and review them. And let's see how good they are. And in doing that, what I found was instead of, well, this is insurmountable, we're not going to be able to do this here, I found that, in fact, what we were doing is just about as good as anything else I was seeing come through the panels. We just had to do some things differently. We had to frame it differently. And that's, but make no mistake, that took probably 2 years. Remember, the Roybal cycle is every 5 years, which makes it worse in a way. I had to wait 5 years before we could go back in again. But those 5 years I spent educating myself to get prepared to put in something better. And with that time, then it also allowed me to maybe, instead of taking it so personally, be more self-critical and looking at that proposal, say, okay, now I can see where the reviewers are going. I see what we did wrong structurally that we can change. But it took time, make no mistake. And again, I fully am aware of this. Some of us don't have the luxury of that time. If you're on the clock, if you're going to go up for promotion, maybe you don't have 3 years to, come to grips with things. I understand that. But yeah, make no mistake, it's not something that you just get over. In fact, you could argue that's the worst thing to do. Many of us have seen examples of people, it could be from a manuscript up to a proposal. Well, it got reviewed and there's all this comments. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm just going to resubmit it. And that usually doesn't have a successful outcome. So, to me, that was the process. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to share more what that was like. I still remember that. I remember that. Yeah, you don't forget those things. So. Oh, yeah, Travonia, please.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Joe. It's so good to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you again. How you doing?
I'm good. It's been a long, long time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that, Joe actually was one of my original mentors when I was at the University of Kentucky. At the time, I think I was like a P1 or P2 student, and he was an assistant professor. And I just wanted you to know that, you planted seeds within me that just helped me to develop a passion, for research. And also too, you motivated me to go forward. So, I just wanted to, thank you for that. Because again, you were like you and Dr. Danner were like literally my first two mentors when I was just starting out my career. So again, thank you for just having taken the time to mentor me during that time, and to you got me excited about potentially pursuing a career in aging research. So
thank you,
like I said,
Travonia,
it's
what you've done with great success.
Just good to see you again.
It's funny you mentioned that. Travonia is being very graceful. If I look back at that time, I personally don't think I was a good mentor. I'm sorry, Travonia. And the reason why is I didn't. Yeah, maybe I'm being too hard on myself. But honestly, I don't. At that time, remember, I think when I first met Travonia, I might have been just my second year in as an assistant professor. I knew very little about mentoring. I didn't have the opportunity to get connected to someplace like the RCMAR or another NI infrastructural center where you can get that professional development. My models were people like Bob Kane and Rosalie Kane. You know, Bob Kane was a great mentor in many ways, but I don't think his mentorship style would be as successful today. In fact, it wouldn't work at all, I think, in many ways. But that's what I had known at the time. I'm glad that it went well. Troy, clearly it did go well, if not for me, for yourself. I mean, you had all those skills and talent to get where you're at. And Trevoni, I think you're on the editorial board of the Gerontologist, right?
No, I'm not.
You're not? Well, I'll invite you then. So, okay, because you should be, because you review a lot for us and we appreciate it. But in any event, yeah, thank you, Trevoni. That actually means a great deal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things I can say honestly is like your passion for what you do was very evident, back then. And, that excitement for research and for making a difference, to me, that was like infectious.
Yeah.
So, I appreciated that.
Thanks, Trevonia. Now, I reflect a lot on those days and, what I did wrong and, in some extent what I did right. It was definitely formative, Trevonia, but I'm so glad. And I always follow your career with such happiness. I mean, you've done such great work. Peggy,
Thank you
please.
for that.
I just want to add one additional thing at this moment. I think it's important also for the scholars to observe and recognize that your mentor doesn't have to be on your campus. This person doesn't have to be in your department or your university at all, but having a diverse mentoring group and different impacts on you throughout your career.
Yeah.
And think of a mentoring, not a mentor, but mentors based on where you are. Your first year, you may need one configuration. By the time you're closer to tenure and promotion, your configuration of mentors may differ. And one of the things I encourage the young scholars at Chapel Hill in terms of my mentoring group is knowing when you need to make the shift, and know if you can who needs to be in that shift based on where you are on your trajectory. And if you have a very good senior person working with you, that person should or can recognize that that shift needs to be made and can support that if there's any pushback from the department head or someone else.
So Peggy, let me ask you a question. Should you have a mentor? I mean, of course, if you have mentors outside campus, great. Should you have a mentor at your home institution or unit?
I think so. For
I do
political
too.
reasons. Some people are there for political reasons.
Right.
And some
Right.
people are there for content or both.
Yeah. Yeah.
And choosing your mentoring group is very political. It's more than academic.
Mm-hmm.
On the long term, it is political as well as, again, looking at scholarly productivity. What will each person bring to the mentoring experience, and what will each person do for you, and what can you do with that person? Because senior mentors want people that are working hard as well. Everybody's still producing. So feel that you have something you can bring to the table, advance yourself while at the table, and offer your skills.
Yeah.
If you see a gap and you can fill that gap among senior people, I advocated this for junior people. Express that without, serious thinking of you're going to have repercussions if you say, well, I know how to do this.
Yeah.
And I can offer that to the group. So
Yeah.
people like that.
Yeah, this idea of it's political sometimes when trying to identify a mentor at a home institution is very true. I'll tell you a story. This is an instance where someone did not develop a strong mentorship or a mentor at their home institute, at their new institution. So this is a person, I had mentored, and they were at, they're at a new institution, kind of maybe early in their tenure track career. I started getting word back from colleagues at this place, which was, this person isn't showing good judgment. They're engaging in certain activities. They're aligning themselves with certain, faculty that are divisive, and what's going on. And so I had to have a conversation with this person who I still, talk with and work with. And, essentially along the lines of you have to identify people in a unit that can and will advocate for you. Because if you have no one to advocate for you and that tenure meeting happens, rightly or wrongly, you're dead in the water. I can't be in the room advocating for you then. So having that local connection, regardless of if, regardless of if maybe they don't have the greatest scientific scholarly affinity with you, is still important to navigate this. We can often be a political landmine in the promotion tenure, and it's not right. And I know this, but it's also how it works sometimes. I think we're coming to the end of our time here. Was there any other final questions, comments here? Otherwise, we'll
Joe,
stop.
I'd like to make one last comment.
Of
Although I
course,
said
please,
I
Peggy.
thought my previous one was my last, but I
Yeah,
guess I
that's
lied
good.
about that.
That's good. Yeah.
My last comment is to know that it's political. It's just
Yeah.
not all about great articles and grants. It is a political process as well.
Yes.
And know the politics of your department, know the politics of your school, and pay attention to the configuration of committees, learn something about the people who are judging you, not necessarily where they live and what they eat, but how to what where they
Yeah.
published,
Yeah.
who they affiliate with. And that's the political part. It's not all about academics. The academic world is quite political,
Oh,
and
yeah.
to become savvy about how do you now understand the politics of academia.
I'll close on this, reflecting on Dr. Dilworth Anderson's final comment. That would actually be a good topic for this when you're next, is the politics of academia. I mean, there's a whole unknown curriculum, isn't there? I did not know anything about it when I started, and I paid the price in some ways. So it's a worthwhile topic. Thank you, as always, Peggy, for your wise, sage insights. Well, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, so I think we've come to the middle of the second day. I know we're having meetings with Dr. Gaugler individually. I don't know if folks have particular last comments or questions.